Welcome to the HockeyDebates.com podcast. I'm Bob Duff. I'm joined by Hockey Hall of Fame writer Kevin Allen of USA Today, and we're here to break down what's going on in the hockey world and tell you everything you knew you needed to know about the NHL. So, Kevin, why don't we start? We had a pretty key injury to Mikko Rantanen in Colorado, and then today a scary moment with Mitch Marner in Toronto, which looks like turned out to be not an issue. But let's talk about how much do you think Colorado's going to miss Rantanen? They're off to such a great start.
Well, I mean, that's a heavy loss. Like, he is to, that team what to Leon Draisaitl is to the, Edmonton Oilers. Like, you talk about the Avalanche now, their offense, and it's McKinnon and Rantanen, and he's a very exciting player. And, the week-to-week designation is always scary because, that tells you, this is a long-term injury, but we don't want to tell you how long it is. And, I think when you get that, the only thing I would say on this is that the Avalanche are in a really good position with the salary cap. If you go to capfriendly.com and check it out, especially with him going on the long-term IR, which gives them some cap relief, like they're in a position, and I think they will take advantage of this to make a move. Like, they're a legitimate contender, and Rantanen is very important. So, even if if he was healthy, I think they were going to consider a move to give themselves, a little more scoring depth or to add a defenseman. And now with Rantanen out, that adds to their, their cap space. And I think, like they're in a position, for example, they could make a run at Taylor Hall. They have the assets, in my opinion, to do that. And I think they have the cap space. And, can you imagine this team if they had, Rantanen comes back and then they were able to add Taylor Hall as well? I mean, that's a pretty dynamic offense already. And you add Taylor Hall, especially if he could get back to playing the way that he did in his MVP season. So I still think I'm bullish on this team, even if Rantanen's out for an extended period. And I think that's the case. I think that's what that week to week is code for is, this is a difficult injury.
Yeah, getting truthful information out of NHL teams about injuries is kind of like getting truthful information out of Donald Trump at a press conference. It's just not going to happen.
That's what it's become.
I really like what Colorado did in the offseason, bringing in guys like Donskoy and Burakovsky, who have Stanley Cup final experience, to add to what was still a pretty young team. I don't know if they might need one more defenseman maybe to really make a deep run. They don't really have a ton of experience on defense, but they could probably use, kind of that steady stay-at-home minute muncher guy. But, those are probably the easiest thing to get in a trade.
Yeah, well, and let's go back to this team when, the big Matt Duchene trade. And I remember I ended up writing an apology column to Joe Sakic because I thought, oh, man, this is just bad news for this team. And, they ended up with Gerard out of the deal. He's a good young defenseman, a terrific skater. And they've, turned it around, and they're, one of the top teams in the league in a very short period of time. And here early on, I was among the many that thought that Joe Sakic was going to be a disaster as a general manager. And turns out he was quite shrewd and has navigated pretty well through some pretty difficult times and come out the other side with a contending team. So I agree with you about the defense. I'd like to see them get one more guy. I do think that Cal McCarr, boy, if there was ever a guy born or designed to play with these Colorado forwards, it's McCarr. And I know he's a rookie, but I think he's already had an immediate impact. And I think, in the long term, he's just going to be perfect for this team.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. You still don't hear anybody when they talk about kind of the top GMs in hockey. You never hear Joe Sakic's name mentioned, but he's taken a team basically that was the worst team in the NHL a couple of years ago, and now challenging to be the best.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And although I would say, I think you'd agree with me, the reputations are born in the postseason. Like, having good regular season teams just doesn't get it done in terms of establishing your reputation. You got to win or at least get to the final. For that reason, I think that's one of that's why we don't hear much about him being, or the top GMs. But I think the other general managers respect the job that he's done. And, that's the thing. When you reach that point, you're kind of already in a pretty exclusive club. I mean, there's only 31 of the guys around the league, and you've had to do something pretty spectacular. In Joe Sakic's case, he was an incredible player to get to that point. And Sakic paid his dues in terms of being on one team and being part of that organization for a lot of years. He's really kind of in a Yzerman-like position. Yzerman now, of course, did go away and come back, but Sakic is with his long-time team, and Yzerman, of course, is with the team that made him famous, or he made that team famous, depending on how you look at it. So I think they're very similar in that regard.
I had an interesting conversation with Joe, would have been 2-3 years ago, I think, at the when they had that first World Junior Summer Showcase in Plymouth. And he was talking about how teams just obsess over systems instead of building a system around the talent they had. He said there's too much of this trying to fit square pegs into round holes in the NHL today. And he thought what teams should be doing is assessing what they have and building their system around the talent at their disposal and not trying to make guys into something they're not.
Well, that's interesting. I agree with that. I think we've seen that NHL has long been a copycat league, and when the Devils were the trap team, then all of a sudden everyone wanted a coach that ran a good trap, or a version of it, ran a left wing lock. They ran in Detroit, and when big goalies have been the rage, everybody wanted a big goalie. There's always been sort of a copycat, and I think that what Joe's talking about is the kind of phenomenon. I mean, just in recent years, when the Penguins won their cups, it was about adding a bunch of guys. They did that anyway with speed, and now you look around the league, and everybody's added. If you're bringing in kind of a role player or an extra guy, you're looking for a guy who's fast as lightning. They care more about that now than they do about what his stats are in the AHL or in college. They want to know what's his 40 time, or at least the equivalent of it, like we see in the NFL Combine. So I can understand what Joe's talking about.
You mentioned speed. I mean, we were just talking about Colorado and Steve Yzerman and Joe Sakic, and Yzerman's first season in Detroit, which looked pretty promising 3-4 games in, now looks like it's a train wreck. And you think of a guy like Taro Hirose, who looked so impressive at the end of last season, but there's a guy who doesn't have wheels, he doesn't have size, and it's like you could even see it toward the end of last season. It looked like teams had figured out how to handle him, and now all of a sudden he doesn't look like the same player at all. And the Wings, they look like they might be the front runners to win the lottery.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a big game for the for those who follow the upside down standings, those who want a good chance at a top 3 pick. I think everyone assumed that the Ottawa Senators were the worst team in the league, but last night I thought the Red Wings showed they're right there with them in that competition. They didn't look like that at the beginning of the season, and they really shouldn't be there when you consider how strong that first line can be. But even that first line has not played nearly as well as it did, early in the season. And of course, I'm speaking about Bertuzzi and Larkin and Mantha. And last night, boy, the team, as Mickey Redmond, the analyst, would say, boy, oh boy. In this case, the team just didn't look like it cared. And I know that's not the case, but boy, that's the way they played. They just played really uninspired hockey last night. And I got to wonder if the early assessment of Steve Yzerman is that, this team isn't nearly as good, and even the younger players, as the Red Wings hoped it would be by this time. I mean, you look at, some of their key players. Well, Rasmussen was sent back to Grand Rapids. Now, he's playing okay down there, but Zadina has not picked it up, and he was going to be their star goal scorer. And even Joe Veleno has started slowly down there, and they're high on him. He can skate, and I know Yzerman likes his 200-foot game, but he hasn't done much even in the AHL. And then you look up top here, Svechnikov, it looks like he's a pretty average player. And your hope is really that centers on Mantha and Bertuzzi and Larkin being good players, and maybe Hronek and Chalowski. I think the jury's still a little bit out on him. So I don't know. Doesn't seem to me like the Red Wings are closing in on being an improved team, unless there are some of the other guys who are lesser visibility players who are going to make the difference.
Yeah, I think Zadina is a big concern. I may not admit it, but when you take a guy at number 6 and he's still that far away from being an NHLer, I mean, you can't miss on number 6. You got to hit when you get it picked that low or high, I guess would be technically the term in the draft. You got to hit the home run, and it doesn't even look like they've got a base hit yet with Zadina.
Well, particularly when everybody in the hockey world knows you passed on Quinn Hughes and Bouchard, the player that I think they were going to take, had Zadina had not fallen to them. And Bob, do you think it's quickness with him? An A to B type quickness. Like he always was able to sort of slide in quickly to the holes, I was told, in junior hockey, but we haven't seen that at the pro level.
Yeah, he seems to really have a hard time finding the space to get the shot off in the scoring areas. I don't know if that's a speed thing. I mean, you see a lot of guys that score at the AHL. I remember they had Timo Pulkkinen a few years ago, and he scored a bunch of goals in the AHL, led the league one year, and he came up the NHL, and his release just wasn't quick enough in the NHL. And when he tried to do that big windup and get the shot away, by the time he got to the puck, they were on him, and the shot was either going wide or it was going to be blocked. And he just never could find that quick release. I remember Mike Bossy saying one time, it's not how hard you shoot it, it's how fast you get rid of it. That's how you score goals. Because you give a goalie in the NHL time to get set for a shot, they're going to stop 99 out of 100.
Yeah, I remember they compared his release to Brett Hall, and then he came up here, and I said, no, it's not Brett Hall-like. I knew Brett pretty well, and, Brett Hall could snap it in a hurry, and we didn't see that with him. I tell you a guy who I think does remind me of Brett Hall, at least on the other side, is Mantha. Just an incredible shot. From all of a sudden the puck is, he's 40 feet out, and suddenly the puck is snapped and it's sizzling toward the net. And the other comparison is that he's not real fond of back checking, and it occasionally makes the kind of play that irritates his coach. So I think there is a little bit of a comparison to Mantha, or to Brett Hall from Mantha.
And he has been accused of being lazy at times, which certainly Brett wore that code a few times in his career.
Yeah, that's for sure. That is for sure. But just wrapping this up with a bow, I think that the Red Wings are right in there for that number 1 pick. I think if we did the reverse power rankings this week, I'd have them number 1.
Well, after watching Alexis Lafreniere in the World Junior Showcase this summer, I think the Wings will be pretty happy to get him.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So we were talking about teams that haven't done what was expected of them, and the Toronto Maple Leafs certainly are not looking like anywhere near a Stanley Cup contender. And this is a team that is supposed to be, loaded. Like we just talked about the young talent in Colorado. Here's another team loaded with young talent, and they just don't seem to be able to find that chemistry to make it work. I think maybe, in my opinion, they've just got too many of the same kind of players, and they just don't really have a good enough mix that they can make a playoff run.
Yeah, they're kind of an interesting team. Like I like the moves that they made in the offseason. I thought the shakeup in defense, to me, I thought it was a favorable situation for them. I thought that Tyson Barrie would be an upgrade over Gardner, and I like the CC acquisition as well. Kerfoot, I'm a real big fan of his as well. I thought, I think it's hard to trade a guy that's hard to play against like Kadri is, but I like Kerfoot quite a bit. And while it just hasn't panned out, they're still just giving up too many goals, and that was their issue last year. And I think it remains their issue. They're always going to score a bunch. They're going to be an entertaining team, but and Anderson's a good goalie. So I mean, it's really all on their defensive play. But the question I would ask is it all on the defense, or is just the team's sort of defensive um, ability up and down the lineup? Is it just not strong enough, or is it not well coached enough? And that's pointed right at Mike Babcock.
And we mentioned Ottawa earlier. Well, DJ Smith is a guy you don't hear much about. I know a lot about him being he's from Windsor. And when he was on Windsor's staff, they were winning Memorial Cups. And then he left and they stopped winning Memorial Cups. He went to Oshawa and won a Memorial Cup there. And he went to Toronto as a reputation as a guy who was on the cusp of being an NHL coach and was known for his defensive acumen. And you look at the Leafs without him certainly look even more lost on the defensive side of the puck than they did last season.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Coaches always say, the one area where they all feel they can make an impact is, defensively. Like you can't teach a guy to be, if you're a 15 goal scorer, a coach can't make you a 50 goal scorer. But if you're a weak defensive player, a coach can sometimes make you an excellent checker and defensive player. So coaches all believe that they can make their team better defensively. And, there's a lot of guys around the league with excellent reputations for being able to do things and strategize to keep the puck out of their net. So, but, it's funny, like no one has ever, Mike Babcock, how many times did Ken Holland say, and I actually believe this, that, he never saw a guy prepare his team better than Babcock did for a game. But have you ever heard anybody say, Babcock's a great defensive coach or a great offensive coach? Nobody ever says that. They just say, he's a good coach. He gets a lot out of his team. So I don't know. What's that mean? Does that mean his strength is as a motivator, as a negative motivator? Because, I don't know that I would say players fear him, but, they don't enjoy the Babcock experience. Like the people, like the players in Carolina love the Rod Brindamore experience. They love playing for him. He's fun to be around. I don't think that the Toronto Maple Leafs are saying that about Babs.
And you just wonder, is it a different era of player, and is he not adapted to it? And he came to Detroit, took over a team that was a proven winner, that, some of them were still around that had played for Scotty Bowman and knew what it was like to play for a taskmaster type of coach. And they were veteran guys who'd won and really didn't need to learn that. The Leafs need to learn how to win. And they're young guys, most of them are, a lot of their core, their key guys are under 25. And, we see it with just millennials in general. Their approach to life is different than the old school thinking. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's just different. And maybe the old school ways of Babcock aren't working with these young guys.
Well, yeah, and you brought up something interesting. And because Babcock came through Detroit and Bowman, of course, is the former Detroit coach, there was always a lot of comparison. But I don't think they're anything close to being alike. You said they're both taskmasters. I would say that's true. But, I think Bowman was a little easier to play for simply because he never really communicated with players. Like, you never felt his wrath in a confrontational way. You only knew he was unhappy with you because your ice time went from 18 minutes a game to 9 minutes a game, or you sat on the end of the bench in the third period, or you were a healthy scratch. That's the only way you knew how Bowman was feeling about you. But, Babcock makes it clear on a daily basis who he's happy or unhappy with. And for that reason, I would say that he's tougher. And I do agree that today's player, the modern player, is a little bit different. And for that reason, I think, it can't be easy. I think players are still today, would prefer to have a Rod Brindamore type, than a Mike Babcock type. Now, saying that, some guys like Seth Jones loves John Tortorella. That's my sense. He loves playing for him. He loves how hard Tortorella is on him. He's not bothered by it. It doesn't ruin his day when Tortorella is mad at him. He just wants to be driven, and I think that just speaks to, how Seth Jones is as a player. He wants to be pushed, and it's kind of like the sort of drill sergeant mentality in the military. There are some guys who thrive in those situations, and I think Seth Jones, really appreciates. I think he sees Tortorella as a coach that really cares. And what's interesting about Tortorella is I think he's an unbelievable fit for that team. For whatever reason, they fit. They seem to like the Tortorella experience for whatever reason. So, and different rooms have different cultures and different ways of bonding. But I think the team in Columbus and the coach there deserve each other in the most positive sense.
The thing I've always thought about Scotty in comparison to Babcock is Scotty would assess his personnel, and he would figure out, how can I get the most out of these guys? He wasn't intransigent about his system. He didn't have to do the things the same way everywhere. He went to Pittsburgh, where he had a team that wasn't very strong defensively, and they played an offensive game, and they won the cup that way. He's won it a lot with defense, certainly, but he's always had talent. He just seems to know what buttons to push to get the most out of a guy, whereas the impression I get of Mike is that he's a guy that this is how we're going to do it, and he's like what Joe Sakic said, he's trying to fit square pegs into round holes sometimes, and it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I do agree that Scotty Bowman was masterful, and that's why he stayed current. Is that he was adaptable? Like he really was a hockey genius in his ability to sort of assimilate to whatever the style was at the time. And I mentioned before the trap era. And Scotty fit into that with the left wing lock, during the wide open era, of course he had the talent to do it, but his teams were flying around. However, and I want to get your thought on this as well. Like my theory on the Penguins, like it was tough for Scotty to come in there because Bob Johnson obviously had passed away, and he was a very popular coach, and he was well loved and everything. But don't you think that you and I could have gone into Pittsburgh and got behind that bench and said before the game, Mario, get it done. And that team would have been all right. That was an era when Mario Lemieux was incredible during the regular season and double incredible during the playoffs, as long as you had someone who could lace up his skates because, he had that back issue. But I've always marveled at Scotty Bowman, and I don't think there's any question he's the greatest coach of all time. But I don't know that I'm giving him too much credit for the second of those cups in Pittsburgh, just because I think a lot of different guys could have taken that team to a championship.
But he did lose Mario for about half the playoffs with a broken hand, so he did have to coach for a little bit in the playoffs.
Yes, he did. He did for sure. But that team was so strong. Even they had Yager, and they just had it going. There's no doubt about it.
When you talk about teams that and players, I guess, that maybe don't get recognition, a guy who should certainly be finally getting some love in the Norris Trophy balloting at the end of the year is John Carlson. I mean, what a start he's off to. He's doing Bobby Orr things, leading the league in scoring.
Yeah, I wrote about him today in USA Today. 18 points his first 10 games, 20 points in his first 11 games. I asked him if he knew what Orr, because when Orr did that, because that's who he tied. He's only the third player in NHL history to have that productive of an October, and he joins Paul Coffey and Bobby Orr. That's pretty good company when it comes to offensive production for a blue liner. I asked him whether he had any idea what kind of production Orr had in November, and he goes, I don't, but I'm pretty sure he must have had 140 points or something. And that ain't going to happen for me, he said. And it's turned out he only had 120, but that was the year that Orr was MVP, Art Ross, and Conn Smythe a winner. So that was an incredible season. But, Carlson, what's interesting about him is he's known, I think, as a blue chip elite defenseman, but he's not in that same grouping. At least I don't think people put him there with, Doughty, Giordano, Hedman, the Norris crew, that we have, Brent Burns, guys that we put in there. And I think this kind of start and the attention it's received, I think might elevate him just to give him that little extra push. Like when you watch an NFL game at the goal line and on a quarterback sneak, the fullback comes in and shoves the quarterback from behind, trying to get him over. I think this start is kind of shoving Carlson kind of over that line a little bit so that everybody starts thinking about him in that regard. And, I think he's been good for a long period here, long period being 3 or 4 years. And I think he had 70 points last year. The question I ask him, and I'll ask you, is what is the ceiling now for a defenseman? Brent Burns had 86 points last year. Do you think it's possible? I mean, the last 100-point defenseman, Bob, was now 27 years ago. Brian Leetch, 102 for the Rangers. So what's the ceiling, and what do we got to get done to get another 100-point defenseman?
Go back to the 1980s, maybe.
Time machine. That's your answer.
Get away from the most important thing in the game being blocking a shot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what that that was a Bob Gainey suggestion, and people giggled at it, and I thought it was brilliant. If you put in a rule that said you can't drop on the ice and block a shot, wouldn't we see more goals?
You would think so, and you'd probably see less injuries too. I mean, how many guys get hurt every year from blocking a shot?
Well, I think that, what he said was, hey, look, if you want to come and, come right at me, mano a mano, more power to you, but no dropping down, no dropping to your knees or sprawling on the ice, any of that stuff. And in that situation, I think that would reduce injuries, and I think it would increase goals. So, because it's, as everyone knows, it's an art to get the puck to the net these days. Like I told Nick Lidstrom when he retired that he should charge every team in the league $100,000 to come in and teach their defensemen how to get the puck to the net, because no one seems to be able to do it as well as Nick Lidstrom did for 2 decades. So, I think he could make another $3 million in retirement just by selling his services to, 31 NHL teams. Well, I guess he's already employed by the Red Wings, so 30 other NHL teams.
And he's done similar work, I know, for the Swedish national team, and that was one of the things I know from doing the book with Nick, that those young Swedish defensemen like Victor Hedman and that wanted to grill him about, is how do you always get the puck to the net?
Yeah. Well, that $3 million then will kind of supplement the big money he made working with you on that book. So I'm sure he could use that money. But I mean, it really is an art, and I don't think Nick Lidstrom, I'm sure, would help absolutely anybody. He's the nicest man, in all of hockey history. So I'm sure he would tell them. But the problem is I'm not sure you can teach that. I think that was instinctual for Nick, just like knocking down pucks at the blue line. Nobody ever did that better either. The puck looked like it would be flying out, and all of a sudden Nick's stick would go up and suddenly be right in the skates. And you're going, what just happened there? It was like he was playing badminton. It would just kind of knock it and, play it down, or, soccer. He was a soccer player earlier in his career, and that probably helped him as well. But he just had great instincts and sort of sensed when he should let it go and when he should hold it and when he should play it off the backboards. And, I'm sure he was great at billiards because he used the caroms, at Joe Louis Arena quite well in order to get the puck in front of the net to his buddy Holmstrom.
And to wrap it up today, Kevin, let's debate this. How is it possible that Nick Lidstrom never won a Hart Trophy, and why don't defensemen not just win the Hart Trophy anymore, but they don't even seem to get consideration for the Hart Trophy anymore? I mean, the old days, Eddie Shore won 4 of them. it just seemed like after Bobby Orr, somebody decided, yeah, that's it. We're not going to give defensemen the Hart anymore.
Well, it's wrong, but I think the reason they don't win it is writers tend to think, well, defensemen got their trophy. It's the Norris. And, as I said, it's the wrong thinking because, as Bobby Orr proved, you can have the kind of season where you were the best player in the league and the top defenseman. And I think there have been instances, and we talked about it before we went live, and obviously, Chris Pronger has done that. But, that was such a unique season. I also think it was Pronger was a unique player, and that's what we wait for as writers, too. We're looking for that kind of unique. Pronger was such a monstrous force, and we didn't have other players like him that were that big and that mean. And, for that reason, I think we were able to kind of separate him and say, well, he's not a normal defenseman. He's a superhero. So we'll make him a candidate for the MVP as well. And again, I'm not saying that's the right way to view it, but that was always my sense that the way the guys looked at it.
To wrap it up, I'll tell you a great little Pronger anecdote. When Michael Layton came up to the Flyers in 2010 when they made that magical run to the finals, he was living in a hotel because he'd come up so late in the season he hadn't got a place to live. And it was his wife and their young daughter, who was, I think, 3 at the time, joined him in Philly for the playoffs. And they're all staying in this little hotel room. And his daughter would get spooked anytime someone walked down the hallway of the hotel. It just frightened her to hear the footsteps outside the door. So what Michael did was he got those, they called fat heads, those giant posters they used to have, life-size posters of NHL players. He got a Pronger. They put it on the back of the door, and his daughter said, now we're safe.
That works. A Pronger fat head.
Well, this has been the Hockey Debates podcast. I'm Bob Duff. This is my partner, Kevin Allen, and we're here every Monday and Thursday sharing our limited wisdom about hockey to the masses. And please join us, and we look forward to it, and have yourself a great day.